You're listening to the Tank Magazine podcast, and in this episode, the writer and activist Sam Thompson traces Mussolini, D'Annunzio and Pasolini in the Italian lakeside town of Salò, a town made iconic by Italy's complex, occluded and dark history. The full text version of this essay is featured in the Tank travel issue.
Walking down the valley from my hotel towards Lake Garda and the town of Salò, the route dips and I lose the lake. When I find it again, I'm relieved. I walk to the edge of the water and peer out where it meets the horizon. It's too easy to personify. The lake is vast and dominates the landscape. The lake is deep and it hides many secrets. Cruelty and sacrifice lie beneath its surface. The poet-philosopher Gaston Bachelard writes about lakes as the first witnesses to the world, heightening their surroundings by reflecting them back. Bachelard quotes Henry David Thoreau, "A lake is the landscape's most beautiful and expressive feature. It is Earth's eye, looking into which the beholder measures the depth of his own nature. We're all bad at regarding our own nature. Italians are no exception." It's early afternoon in September. Most shops are closed for lunch, and the water transmits a calmness onto the town. I contemplate swimming, but the lapping of the lake's limpid periphery is so peaceful. There's an antiques shop selling kitchenware, scooters and records. Nestled between the kitsch is a shining bust, only the bald head visible. Price €60. I ask the proprietor what it's made from. He beams back and shouts, "Mussolini!" Let's remember fascism in Italy, not the sanitized version accommodated by the Italian establishment, represented by the likes of Silvio Berlusconi as little more than a zealotry for Italy's greatness to be realized. Let's remember Italian political life from Benito Mussolini's bloodless seizure of the Italian state in 1922 until his death near the end of the Second World War. There was one party, one leader, Il Duce, unchallenged politically or ideologically. Representative government was a farce. De facto power was in the hands of the Grand Fascist Council. Violence was at the core of social life. Left-wing activists were imprisoned, tortured and killed. Working-class institutions and trade unions were regularly set alight. Black shirts, the fascist party's armed militia, roamed the streets. Abroad, Mussolini embarked on a brutal imperialist project attempting to recapture Mediterranean lands once controlled by the Roman Empire. Returning to Rome after his campaign of chemical warfare in Ethiopia, Il Duce exclaimed to the salivating crowds of black shirts and soldiers, "The Italian people has created the empire with its blood. It will fertilize it with its labour and defend its arms against anybody whomsoever." Reflecting Mussolini's admiration for Nazism and growing friendship with Hitler, the state introduced laws prohibiting interracial marriage and barring Jews from many professions. Undergirding all this was the absolute logic of Italian fascism, the sustenance of privilege and profit. Italy declared war on France and Britain in June 1940. Mussolini was an inept military strategist, and a disastrous campaign in Tunisia precipitated the invasion of Sardinia by Allied forces. The Grand Fascist Council knew they were losing the war and wanted rid of Il Duce. Following secret negotiations with the enemy, the Italian king agreed to switch sides and fight against the Nazis. Mussolini was arrested and imprisoned. News of his internment piqued Hitler's affection for his inept, peacocking ally, and he arranged for a daring air rescue by Nazi special forces. Hitler reinstated Il Duce as the fascist leader of a shrunken Italian state, headquartered, for its proximity to Germany and distance from the invasion, in Salò. This brief statelet was known as the Italian Social Republic, or the Republic of Salò. By Liberation Day on 25th of April 1945, Italy had the largest grassroots resistance to fascism in Europe, totalling 250,000 people. The Garibaldi brigades of the Italian Communist Party, the PCI, were the biggest and best organised, but most progressive parties were represented to some degree. The partisans were a mixed bag. Some were sincere anti-fascists, others just hated Il Duce. Many wanted to expiate their guilt at fascist complicity, and for some it was a tactical move, anticipating Mussolini's imminent downfall. But even after the Allied invasion, fascism remained popular. Mussolini endeavoured to enlarge his fascist squadrons in order to fight the resistance, and 400,000 people served in Salò's military and security forces. These soldiers of the final days of fascism were more doctrinaire, and pursued the project of Jewish expulsion with renewed enthusiasm. This is how the writer Primo Levi ended up in Auschwitz. Mussolini's henchmen also sought revenge against those in the Grand Fascist Council who had plotted against him. 5 were executed, including the leader's son-in-law. The puppet government provided an opportunity for a fresh attempt at establishing a truly fascist state, liberated from the interests of the church, king, and capitalist oligarchs. In its first days, Mussolini made a broadcast to the whole country promising that the new regime would be national and social in the fullest sense. The plan was to return fascism to the warped authoritarian socialism of its origins. All activity necessary for self-sufficiency was to be socialized. The decision-making body of the new republic was to be elected by soldiers, union officials, and professional groups. And uncultivated land was to be appropriated by farm labourers. The Republic of Salò never had the power to put any of these ambitions into effect. Every economic policy was dictated by Berlin, but the intention nevertheless had an impact on the Republic's inhabitants. The area was saturated with propaganda. The spirit of fascism was enacted in plays and other cultural events, and for some it became a period of intense radicalization. The main consequence of this was not a different structure to social life, but something much more mundane and short-lived. An invigorated bloodlust amongst the police and armed squads, which led to horrific cruelty during combat with partisans in 1944. Salò signalled a key moment of ideological departure from fascism for many Italians, a departure which has enabled some to distance themselves from their country's ugly history. After the war, the term collaborator referred only to those who supported the Republic of Salò, and by extension betrayed Italy by becoming patsies for Hitler. This semantic point was part of a wider trend of leniency towards those who'd supported fascism and benefited from its bullying and backdoor deals. Those fascists who were put on trial were given sympathetic sentences, which ultimately allowed some of them to re-enter Italian political life soon after the war. To some extent, the nation absolved itself of complicity in fascism for the 20 years prior to the Republic. Despite the state-sanctioned transportation of 70,000 Jews to German death camps, Italian Jews had one of the highest survival rates in Europe. It's possible to do a little tour of the buildings that were repurposed as fascist ministries during the Republic. I start on the outskirts of the city at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, now the 4-star Hotel Lorin. It's gaudier and fuller than my hotel, and I feel a strange sense of loyalty towards the Hotel Arcadia. Bougainvillea ascend the entrance, and palm trees fan the pool. A man loiters between the front door and garden deck chairs. I walk over and ask what he thinks about the hotel's history. He looks puzzled for a second, and then his face clears. "Oh, the fascist stuff. Yeah, they sure had good taste." He's American. I walk west through the town, stopping off at the Office of Interpreters, the Ministry of Popular Culture, and the Department of Performing Arts. I linger outside Villa Cartagna. During the Republic, it was the police headquarters. Now it's a bank. I end at the Stefani Agency, which dealt with press releases. The Republic of Salò wasn't solely based in Salò. Mussolini was housed in Gargano, the other side of Lake Garda. Important ministries were placed in Brescia and Venice. The name stuck because Salò held the Ministry of Culture, which was responsible for producing anti-Allied and pro-German propaganda, so pivotal to the consensual functioning of the Republic. Verona Airport, hotel, shower, pasta, and then to the Vittoriale. It calls me with a sense of authority. For anyone with even a passing interest in history or literature, it would be a scandal to skip the Vittoriale. Gabriele D'Annunzio, the celebrated poet and proto-fascist ideologue, started renting the building from the state in 1922. It was to be his semi-retirement home after injuring himself falling from a window. There are whispers one of Mussolini's thugs pushed him. The fascist inner circle feared his cult-like following might lead to a leadership challenge and wanted to keep him far away from political life in Rome. Part of their strategy was to finance the continued renovations and additions to the Vittoriale in its gardens. I arrived tired and sweaty, but with an anticipation that tastes like school trips to musty National Trust castles. I wander through the pomegranate trees, apple orchards, geckos and ashtrays. There are 4 humble graves at the dog cemetery. Crissa, Zan, one unmarked and one with a name that's been eroded away. They're the first monuments to death or suffering that I see in Italy. 2 women from Edinburgh are discussing their impression of D'Annunzio from the tour of the house. You don't like him, but I think he was all right. At least he had style and a sense of humour. The house is stuffed with curios and ephemera from every continent and every period in history. It's like having a conversation with someone who relentlessly recounts anecdotes and factoids. You never get a word in edgeways, and eventually their anal solipsism becomes tedious. The darkened rooms, a war injury left D'Annunzio photophobic, makes me yearn for the brilliant sun outside. In the poet's bedroom, there's a broken steering wheel with religion of risk embossed upon it. The shared lineage of D'Annunzio and the futurists is clear. The first article of Filippo Tommaso Marinetti's Manifesto for Futurism elevates danger to a social virtue. There are 33,000 books in the house, including a whole room of German philosophy and poetry. D'Annunzio didn't speak a word of German. The tour guide is fervent in her claims that D'Annunzio was not a fascist. I ask if this is the official belief of the Vittoriale's custodians. The guide points back towards the house's entrance. There are 2 doors, she explains. The right-hand door is for welcome guests, the other for unwelcome guests. Mussolini entered once, on the left. Couldn't he have disliked Mussolini and the fascist party but still been a fascist? Later, past 100 Buddha statues, a Napoleonic death mask, and a plaque pronouncing genius and pleasure, the guide shouted back to us, "Remember, D'Annunzio wasn't a fascist. He wasn't a Nazi." He could have been one without the other. Gabriele D'Annunzio was born in 1863, 7 years before Italian unification, which he regarded as the heroic moment of world history. A mercurial youth, D'Annunzio published his first novel, The Child of Pleasure, at the age of 19. He continued to publish plays, poetry and prose until his retreat to Lake Garda. In 1897, D'Annunzio won a seat in Parliament. His programme was vapid patriotic chauvinism. The fortune of Italy is inseparable from the fate of beauty, of which Italy is the mother. During the First World War, D'Annunzio was a keen advocate of Italian intervention, much like Mussolini, whose pro-war stance finally wrenched him from the Socialist Party. The poet embarked on missions flying over Vienna, dropping nationalistic propaganda and earning a reputation for grand gestures and valour. The most bizarre episode of D'Annunzio's life, the period when he truly lives up to his command to make your own life as you would make a work of art, is the Fiume affair. After the First World War, the now Croatian city of Fiume was a diplomatic poker chip. The Treaty of London promised the town to Italy, but the signatories reneged and gave it to Yugoslavia. D'Annunzio responded by invading Fiume with a small militia of ex-conscripts and illegally occupying the city. His military dictatorship lasted a year and became known for nightly poetry readings and orgiastic parties. In the end, D'Annunzio could claim a great victory. Fiume was assigned to Italy, inaugurating 20 years of Italian rule. D'Annunzio was a fascist in the way that Douglas Hyde was an Irish Republican. These men were more than party members or advocates of political movements. They motivated the activity of members and gave texture to their respective movements. Some things are more concrete. D'Annunzio's involvement in the Great War generated some of the most recognisable rhetoric of Italian fascism, such as the mutilated victory, UKIP anyone, and Mene Frego, roughly translated, I don't give a damn. During the occupation of Fiume, D'Annunzio's style of leadership and law and order platform prefigured Mussolini's mode of intimidation. All D'Annunzio's political convictions rested on a belief in a natural hierarchy. The greatest sum of well-being shall go to the privileged. The plebeians remain slaves. They will never feel at their shoulders the name of freedom. Whether there are traces of anti-Semitism in D'Annunzio's work is a matter of scholarly debate. His life attests to a tolerance of Jewish company and collaboration, despite often allowing his ideas to be used by a jingoistic right. During the Fiume affair, pro-D'Annunzio agitprop sought to blame the poverty of those living in Yugoslavia on the League of Nations and international Jewry. D'Annunzio distanced himself from these claims and was, on the whole, supported by the Jewish population. However, the poet displayed a disdain for supposedly Jewish physical and psychological characteristics. In Pleasure, he writes of a low-browed Hebrew with greedy hands. The Vittoriale is an Italian Hearst castle, but it's impossible to imagine popular Italian culture understanding D'Annunzio in the way Citizen Kane understood Randolph Hearst, as essentially American and essentially corrupt. The palace is a monument to vanity and, in this sense, presaged the turn in Italian politics after the corruption scandals of the 1990s and the fall of the communists. If there's sin, let it be vanity, and if there's vanity, let it be spectacular and plain to see. This exalting of image over policy, form over substance, is best articulated by the rise of Silvio Berlusconi. In fact, Berlusconi is known for owning mansions all over Italy. Villa Certosa in Sardinia has 68 rooms and 168 acres. There were rumours in 2015 that he was negotiating its sale to Saudi royalty. The house boasts of an ice cream parlour, a pizzeria, 6 swimming pools, a lagoon, and a huge Poseidon mural. Like Vittoriale, Certosa has an amphitheatre. The Vittoriale's is now a public music venue. Over the summer, the Lumineers and Joan Baez played there. Berlusconi was once a crooner and has a passing interest in opera. Perhaps he flaunted this when political figures came to visit. Maybe there are bawdier shows when the politicians are absent. The transition from D'Annunzio's castle to Berlusconi's is the streamlining of Italian culture. Expunge the stuff that's difficult, contradictory or subversive. Leave the Dante and the myth of Leda, but keep the gelato and stadiums. I'm sitting in the corner of the hotel dining room, halfway through a 5-course meal, when communal song breaks out. The show is orchestrated by the hotelier, with lead vocals from a theatrical woman 2 tables down. Unwittingly, bless them, the guests link themselves with the characters in Pier Paolo Pasolini's final masterpiece, Salò, or the 120 Days of Sodom. There was a strangely moving moment in the film when the torturers, sat around the dining table, break into spontaneous song. It's a war anthem, Sul Ponte di Parati, honouring Italy's fallen Alpine soldiers. The emotional impact is acute and hard to understand, sandwiched between scenes of humiliation and suffering. At the Parati Bridge there is a black flag. Then the key line, the best of youth is being buried. We see the lines sung by 2 young men, one guard and one victim, both looking deeply affected. The sentiment coming from the hotel guests is similar, mournful and nostalgic. They can't know that I'm thinking about a scene from a film replete with torture and sadism while they're singing, but they're aware that I'm listening, swaying my head slightly in time to the melodies. The songs have the generic pull of folk music, a wistfulness for childhood and home, sung with the confidence of a collective history. I learned later that the songs were Finnish. It could have pushed me away from Pasolini, but instead it drew me to his memory. Pasolini gives you just enough to make you think you understand him, then delights in pulling the rug from under your feet. The first time that Bernardo Bertolucci met Pasolini, in the early 1950s, he mistook the young poet for a thief. When Bertolucci told Pasolini about his mistake, Pasolini replied that it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. Bertolucci got his first credit working on Pasolini's debut feature, Accattone, and went on to direct widely canonized films like The Conformist and Last Tango in Paris. He is still making films to this day. Pasolini's path was a little different. He was raised all over Italy, but grew attached to the northeast, particularly the Friulian language. His father, whom he detested, was a fascist, and his mother, whom he adored, was not. Pasolini's brother Guido was killed as a result of infighting between partisans in the Second World War. He published poetry and novels before he made films, and went on to become a true polymath, painting, writing political polemics, journalism and film theory, who was deeply committed to activist life in Rome. Antonio Gramsci, founder of the PCI, played a huge part in Pasolini's thinking, and following his lead, Pasolini strove to create a popular art aimed at an ideal people. His filmmaking went through 3 clear stages. In the first, heavily influenced by neorealism, Pasolini explored the lives of pimps and prostitutes. In the second, he made metaphorical, symbolic films at the fulcrum of the European avant-garde. Linking these periods is the Gospel according to Matthew, in which Pasolini depicts Christ's material poverty and proletarian activism, while transforming him into a symbolic repository for homoerotic and communist desire. Pasolini's third phase attempted to reclaim the innocent joy of human sexuality through studies of medieval literature. Pasolini was murdered on a beach in Ostia just outside Rome in 1975, beaten beyond recognition and run over with his own Alfa Romeo. The young man convicted of the crime was a sex worker. The standard story is solicitation gone wrong. But there were others involved who were never identified. The case was closed early, and many think it was inadequately investigated. Some suspect a political motivation, possibly from a neo-fascist group. By the time of his death, Pasolini had rejected Gramscian counter-hegemony and had arrived at a bleak left-wing pessimism. "We should never hope for a society in which people are free," he said in an interview a few months before he died. Hope is something invented by politicians to keep the electorate quiet. Throughout his life, Pasolini had a complex relationship with the Communist Party. After the Second World War, the intellectual and cultural life of Italy was intimately coupled to the PCI. The Christian Democrats had the state, the PCI had civil society. Given his family history, politics was always personal for Pasolini. He wrote a column for the PCI weekly newspaper, which engaged working-class readers in a dialogue about the ambiguities of faith and sexuality. His writing was censored, and later his column was pulled altogether. Pasolini was eventually exiled from the party for seducing the children he was teaching. Despite this fractious relationship with the party, Pasolini remained a Marxist, and his films reflect the most vital element of Italian communism. They address and depict a wide base, encompassing factory workers, poor farmers, and the cosmopolitan bourgeoisie. Salò was Pasolini's last film. Often people take it as his final statement, but he was full of life and ambition when he was murdered. He planned More High Allegory, a film revolving around a couple following a star they believed to be guiding them to the new Messiah, only to be bitterly disappointed. But Salò is sui generis in Pasolini's filmography. Arguably, it's unique in the whole of film history. At least, anything that aspires to be Salò, or like Salò, is automatically hideous. Salò is Salò, misunderstood, miscategorized. I once saw it in the video nasty section of a Blockbuster. Unbearably beautiful, unbearably disgusting, and unbearably true. The film transposes the story of the Marquis de Sade's 120 Days of Sodom to the Italian Social Republic. In a dark room, the libertines, 4 middle-aged men, duke, magistrate, president, bishop, sign a contract. All is good if it's in excess. Boys and girls between the ages of 16 and 18 are rounded up, inspected for their beauty and kidnapped. One boy is caught after trying to escape on his bike. He looks straight into the camera, apologetic and bashful. There are shots of Salò and the part of the lake where I contemplated swimming. The youths are driven to a stately home where they are raped, humiliated, forced to eat each other's shit, and tortured. The film ends with their mutilation and murder. The libertines take it in turns to watch from a window. They use binoculars, turning them around, playing with the size of the images. Next to the viewing chamber, two of the guards dance together. "What's your girlfriend's name?" one asks. "Margarita," the other replies. Like Theodor Adorno in Dialectic of Enlightenment, Pasolini understands Sarde's work as taking rational morality to its logical conclusion, the destruction of compassion and pleasure, and the treatment of people as mere objects. 30 years before Pasolini's film, Adorno was linking Sarde with fascism. Science dominates nature, the mind is made natural, and so men become material, and no more than potential stimulation for those in power. This leads, inevitably, to archaic terror in a fascistically organised form. When morality is drained of the grounds for its content, respect for human beings, based on their inherent value, we're left with empty rationality posing as ethics. These arrangements amount not so much to pleasure as to its regimented pursuit, organisation, just as in other demythologized epochs, the schema of its activity was more important than its content. Paolo Bonacelli, who plays the Duke, said in an interview on the set of Salò, "We do not play psychological characters. We are schematic in how we act, the things we do." This idea of the film as lacking any psychological texture is well represented by the original Italian poster of the film, which shows a mass of tangled, headless limbs composed of the cut-out bodies of victims. In Adorno's interpretation of Sarde, the libertines conceive of sexuality in fundamental contradiction to tenderness. Tenderness is transformed sexuality, the passing of a hand over a head of hair, a kiss on the forehead, express the delusion of spiritual love, a pacified forms of the blows and bites of the sex act. The same is true in Pasolini's film. Moments of intimacy are devastating because they are futile, pointless and naive. In a passionless, adulterous ceremony, the two most beautiful slaves are married. They are put in a white room in order to consummate their marriage while the libertines watch. It's a long shot, and the two naked bodies look fragile. The boy kisses her gently, she ruffles his hair, and they smile. Moments later, they are both raped. In an earlier scene, a guard stops and stares at one of the servants. It's mutual recognition of desire between the bacchanals of power and cruelty. Later, the libertines find them having awkward sex on a tiny bed. The guard stands, gives the red fist salute, and is shot dead. The film is as critical of the victims, those who eat the shit, as it is of the fascists who feed it to them. The fascists, after all, are monsters, and therefore beyond judgment. At the time of his death, Pasolini was disillusioned with politics, culture, and the Italian people. He thought television was corrupting the minds of the once proud Roman proletarians, and saw little capacity in the left for fighting this. At the time, he seemed like a grumpy misanthrope, but now we can see the far-reaching prescience of Pasolini's concerns. Only through a monopoly over the media, in particular television, was Berlusconi able to get into power and effect a deep progression in Italian political life. And only through its inability to respond to the massification of culture was the PCI able to crumble. It might be comforting to re-watch the neo-realist films of the 1940s and 50s and think of how much society has changed, but I will continue to study Salò and remember the things that haven't. There is a dream sequence in Acatone in which the titular hero is barred from his own funeral. He breaks into the cemetery and begs with the gravedigger to move his body so that he's buried in the light. There will never be a monument to Pasolini in Salò. There are dozens of busts, sculptures and quotes commemorating D'Annunzio. A Baroque podium pays tribute to the fallen of the world wars. Every street still has some remnant of fascist architecture, but there will never be a monument to Pasolini.
To hear more podcasts from Tank Magazine, be sure to subscribe through the iTunes Store. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.